We are delighted that Steve is here with us tonight. Steve Dieffenbacher has lived in the Oregon Rogue Valley since 1989. His full-length book of poems, The Sky is a Bird of Sorrow, was published by Wordcraft of Oregon in 2012. Ranging from Oregon to the Southwest to Latin America, the poems, written over a 20-year span, are a journey of connections made, lost, and rediscovered during a lifetime. The collection was a finalist for the 2013 Four-Word Prize for Poetry, awarded to books by independent publishers. A poem in the book, Night Singer, Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, was named a finalist this year for the Spur Award for Best Western Poem. His work is also included in the 2012 anthology, What the River Brings, Oregon River Poems, and his poem Emptiness won the 2010 Poetry Prize sponsored by Cloud Bank magazine of Corvallis. His poems are also widely anthologized, and he is published in numerous regional journals. Steve's been an editor at the Mail Tribune in Medford, so he lives in Southern Oregon, where he writes a monthly column focusing on nature and hiking for the newspaper's Sunday travel section. He's won various awards for writing, photography, and page design in his more than 35 years as a journalist. So I'm really pleased, and would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, Steve Dieffenbacher. We are delighted to have you here. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I mean, I've heard so much about the pond and the pond house, and I always envision reading in a place like this. I can only remember one other reading I've done like this where you were actually looking out across water, and that was in Coos Bay, and that was so long ago that I really missed something like this. And I want to thank Tom for inviting me, and I'm glad that I've come north. It's always been difficult for me because now I live in I'm not really a big city person, even though people laugh at me when I think of Portland that way. And of all the cities I've lived in, Portland is the most livable because it's really just a collection of neighborhoods. It's the more and more I've gotten to know it. And it's got great suburbs like Milwaukie and Lake Oswego and some of the others. But I always have an adjustment to make to get used to the traffic and everything. But the one nice thing is coming in April, and I'm so glad to be here today. And the way the day turned out, it's just a beautiful day here. And it reminds me of that William Stafford line where he talks about the insane green of an Oregon spring. And it became more and more insane the more north I came, which was great. I am going to read mostly from this book, actually entirely from this book. And I did want to say one thing about the title, because sometimes I have gotten a few questions about it. The word sorrow, for me, sorrow is not grief necessarily. It's sort of our existential condition. It's the sense of, I guess, loss, inherent loss when we're born, and that we live with all our lives. So it's not a bad thing for me. It's sort of part of the dark and light of existence. Tom kind of mentioned the landscapes that I mostly write about in the book, so I'm not going to go into that, but there are a few that are, I think every landscape really in poetry is somewhat imaginary because the poet adds their own vision to whatever landscape they're describing. So some of them actually become kind of surreal as I go into the poems later in the reading. But I'm going to start with Latin America because I spent actually most of my childhood there. My father worked outside the country, and I only came back to the U.S. because he died when I was 13. So my experience early in life was mostly in a Spanish-speaking culture. Naked on the beach. Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, 1955. I took my clothes off and put them under the palms. The docks were voiceless, the boats already rocking out to sea. Along the beach I walked whiter than the sand, whiter than the sun's words of heat and color. The coconut cutters waved, the brown fishermen rowed, the women swayed with their baskets, turning to the sound of the sea. I walked for hours beside the palms in the horizon's white silence. When my parents found me, I could not remember where I'd been, or where my clothes were, or what the sea had said. I'm going to move kind of back and forth in the book, but actually there's a kind of progress I hope that the reading will show. This is more of an Oregon landscape. The ice of love. What we hear at night under the grass is the ice of love. We who walk disconsolate cannot follow these sighs unless earth rises, cannot cross the river unless stones move. We hear these groans as the continent's breath heaving out of distance from plains of frost. Under this belt, time is green and ancient, the voice of water when ice rushes out of mountains to a gorge of flesh. I had written poetry when I was in my 20s. I actually was an English major, and then I realized I couldn't make a living probably doing that, so I changed to journalism, and I thought, well, this is one way to learn writing and just having to do it every day. So I made that shift, and I kind of fell out of writing poetry while I was involved so much in my career as a young man. But I came back in my 40s, so this is kind of a life journey, but it was actually a journey that starts in the middle of my life. And one of the things that turned me back to poetry was I went through a breakup, a divorce, and I knew my life was going to be different. So I was trying to come to terms with what kind of a life I would have. I don't really need those. So this poem was written after a very long hike to the headwaters of the Rogue River at Boundary Springs, and it's at the north edge of Crater Lake National Park. And it is called Headwaters. A nomad now autumnal, I wander below the mountain, turn from desert and stone, my marriage of iron kisses. All day through gray dust, my feet are clouds of pumice rising under the gathering storm, a numbness of the broken land. Then the sky becomes silent, and I know one rhythm only of limb and grief that moves into its own quiet under the clatter of birds passing over the white, dead wood, until I pass with them into the darkness of fir, into the sound of voices that are no more my foolish life moaning, but the sound of water calling. I stand then in fullness, as the water splashes like milk over the molding stones, a whisper of one man naked, returning at last my call to water, the source of the world, words of stone and mud. My friends kind of joke, kid me a lot about the word stone, because if you went through my poems, you'd probably find more stones in there than just about anything else. But I do believe that has changed as I've gotten older. There was some water in that poem, and I've gotten more and more water in as time has gone on. But they do kind of represent the two sides of life to me in some ways. There's the water to me is a very animate thing, and stones seem lifeless. They're inanimate, but in many native cultures, they don't have a word for death. Things are either animate or inanimate. And so they believe that stones have a spirit or have a life. And so that's made me think over the years about what kind of a life they might have. And some of my poems are an attempt to explore that possibility. Around the time of the breakup, that I did try something that I still do periodically because I think it's a very interesting exercise, is I tried to write in a female voice. And we all have male and female in us, but I was interested to see how my writing might be different in that voice. And actually the chapbook back there called At the Boundary is almost all from that perspective. So this is one of those poems. The Echo of Small Birds. All along the ridge line, she senses them in brush on stony ground, a trail of pine and oak. She can barely hear them, turning only toward their faint calls as she feels herself fade. This is not what she has come for, this severing of self, this loneliness up a slope of stones. She has only followed the path she was meant for, a rise clearly marked and strewn with leaves. All her life she has waited for something to come over the horizon, some blast of yellow or rust, but nothing has come to her except this bustle of wings out of brush, a breeze leaning into stillness, some far away hum. One of the things that I have done increasingly as time has gone on is I'm very curious about where we came from, prehistory, what we have brought with us into the past, and maybe what we've lost. So I've written a number of poems exploring what that might be, even though all I'm doing is guessing. But I find that an interesting exercise too. The ghost of Neanderthal man comes to Lascaux. He comes into the cave as I stand on the ledge with the stone bowl red with ochre, not seeing his ridges lost in shadow, the arms heavy with hair. I lean like a dancer into the wall, brushes forming deer along this rock with a brain so finally human. My torches burn, but he still comes, a shadow across my brow, moving out of my past, fainter than any breath of ice and snow, of graves so deep they shape this ground. Hold your hand up like stone. Fan the fire inside our circle. Find the axe inside the rock. Walk here inside me. Come from my shadows, and I will hold you. Tell me who we are. There is still time. In 1991, there was a prehistoric man that was found in the Alps, and partly as a result of climate change, apparently, because he was found in a glacier that had been covered over with ice and snow for hundreds of years, and then finally the snow melted and he was found. And a lot of research was done on this man. One of the most intriguing things about him is the theory that has come out about how he ended up there, how he died. And this is an attempt in poetry to depict what I've read about this theory. Death of the Iceman. In that moment, he is checking something, perhaps one of the unfinished arrows or the fine copper axe, his symbol of authority. It is spring, but still cold in the Alps, the wind rising. He thinks he is safe now, thinks he has outrun them as he stands near the pass. Earlier in the forest, seeds had whirled around him, hornbeam flakes in fragmentary sunlight. He paused there first, washing his hurt hand in the stream, and climbed on. Now on this ledge he puts his grass cloak down, holds the quiver in one hand, looking at the mountains, sensing snow. Then from the rocks a crack of footsteps, and he begins to turn, falling into that glacial twilight, those centuries of waiting with an arrow in his back. One of the things that we do carry is a lot of violence in our species. This one I won't have to say any more than the title, and the context will be clear. At the Little Bighorn. How bare the land was, hardly a sagebrush to hide behind, rifle pits hollowed from resistant earth. Today from the last hill a sea of buffalo grass winds to the curling river's narrow haven of trees. Beyond where the Indian village stood, farmland and a mute freeway, then spare unrolling plains. Under this cloudless sky, signs of the clash wheel over wind-scoured miles, headstones tracking the disarray. Here they made a stand, then moved on. There they broke, leaving their dead in clay that couldn't hold blood. To the south, the far Wolf Mountains stretch blue across illusory space. Some direction they may have looked for out of the smoke. A history already beginning to blur. I almost hate to read this one next, but I'm going to do it because I actually skipped one, but I'm going to come back to it, so you'll be relieved when I come back to that one. I love the outdoors. I spend as much time as I can out there. I go out when it's raining, when it's snowing. I don't really mind a little weather, but and I can see beauty in almost everything out there. I mean, everything actually is beautiful, and so I do have a mystical streak in me. And the way Alan Watts defines mysticism is a sense of being in harmony with the world around us. And he isn't talking about happiness in the sense, in contentment or an epiphany necessarily, but as being so connected with it that we're not really separate from it. And I like that definition of mysticism. But there is a side of nature that is Darwinian, and the other side of the mysticism will be in some of the poems after this, but this is that there can't be any light without darkness is Watts's feeling about the world. And in many ways, that seems to be the world that I live in. I see that. The character in this poem was actually a classmate of mine, and this is a true incident, and some of you may even know of it, although it happened quite a while ago. Glacier Park, night of the Grizzly, 1966. The four new girls, the summer crew, must have looked at each other in that intractable quiet, in the faint, lowing whisper of the just cold air, as the sky's light struck her like a scar, her, the fated one, who may have believed it was just watching, was even a benevolent eye. She opened herself then to the twilight, the gloom reeling around her, just her, and for a moment she sighed, must have, in the wonder of it, the sky's dimming sparks, that sheet of sequined light. The bear sent sudden upon her. She reeled out of her dream as the first slash peeled her skin, the sheer grunting bigness of him, uncompromising and feral on her, unrolling layer upon layer of skin, with each swing white and red to the whiteness again of bone. And then, when the zipper jammed, trapping her amniotic, fecal and screaming in that bag, dragged her over the ragged ground, skyglint of stones half eaten, she gave him everything she had, her dream of a cafe in Paris, the slow touch of the Frenchman she had not yet met, the sudden tightness in her womb, long past due. I went for quite a few years not reading that poem. It's a very difficult one for me to read, but in recent years a lot has happened in the world, and some of it seems true to what we see out there. This next poem, though, will get back to the other side of nature, although not strictly nature. Well, yes, I think so, actually. Lovemaking. You want to believe in its transcendence, a going out of this life where sensation can only be what lives in the hour of need. It is what you wish your life to be, every moment a whisper or a howl, every act the God you might have made. You want every day to build and wane in the center of it, a music that fills you, this sudden everything that comes from the loneliness you were born with, that mewling human fear so large now you feel it on your back, a wing without flesh or voice, taking all you have of heart and tongue to give more than you deserve. We had a little rain today, so I thought this one would be a getting back to water, which is almost always a good thing. Rain. Some nights rain cries from a roof so uncaring it calls for listening. A dream of someone missing, a hidden snakeskin on a desert plain, gates open to red sagebrush and cicada. How the uncalled for profound sandstone is such sweet pain in the clear presence of rocks. The dry canyon that falls into water, a lizard's kiss out of the desert, summoned only with trying. There's a little bit of a paradox there, because one of the in the Eastern religions, the idea in Taoism is to actually not try, to just that it's better not to try, to just let go. But sometimes you try and try, so you have to try to let go. So in a way, you do have to try. And if that sounds like a Zen koan, I might write it down. I do a lot of traveling, almost exclusively in the West. And as Tom mentioned, I do spend a fair amount of time when I can travel in the Southwest. And Oregon is my home, and so some of the things I feel in the Southwest, I feel here. I mean, I can't imagine living anywhere else than Oregon. But there is a resonance there from the landscape, the combination of the landscape and the native cultures that are there, which is pretty unique in this country, at least the places I've seen. So this poem, it's actually one of the ones that Tom mentioned I came out of a trip to Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, with a friend of mine. Night Singer, Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Your voice comes out of firelight at the far end of the campground, an irresistible wind etched in moonlight along the cliff. All day you crossed the dirt road for water or sat still at the table, holding yourself in. A Pueblo descendant, I say to my friend, nodding toward your dark body as he nods back. Now I cannot see you, but feel your breath stir as stars stream like froth over us. I wonder how it is to be alone among strangers in your own land. Your voice, all that colors a land you no longer know until it is nothing but sound. I know you have a life different from what I make of it, a clerk perhaps in Jemez Springs, who lingers in abandoned ruins to force a daytime grace, refusing to answer the consonants of nearby foreigners razoring the air. But now they are gone. My friend and I walk close as you lie unmoving in the sun, watching birds sway among rocks. In the afternoon we drift near your tent, study the quiet ground and screen of trees, gaze briefly into a cave just yards away, and turn back. That night, moths hover around our lanterns as we sit quietly with our coffee, writing a country of words in the quiet until your lament returns to us, calls of an unknown language shadowing the frail moon, unhurried and wordless. Waiting, Taos, New Mexico. It is morning. The air is clear. I stretch toward the plain, the swing of birds under a calling sky, the knot of language distilled to yes and loss. Shadows hang over the sangre de Cristos. All is still. This moment, this ahora, is the breath of piedras de la tierra, stones of the earth rising in the hope of rain. Over the hills day takes its sweet time, but no rain comes. What good does it do to think under so much sky? Moon announces night. The violet of departure closes in, a relief from longing. Let this indigo gather, the darkening cumulus of twilight that stretches into silence. Aquí soy, es todo lo que necesito. All I need is here. I exist in loss, hungry always for the food of waiting. There's some family poems in here, apart from the ones that I have earlier about the family, the breakup. And when my father died, when I was 13, he was inspecting one of those huge fuel tanks in Latin America, and he was at the top of the tank, and he had a coronary at the top of the tank. He was near the edge of it, though, and he fell off. It was the determination was that he had probably succumbed to the heart attack, but I was haunted by that story for many, many years, and I had this dream that recurred over and over again, and for some reason I was not outside, which is I was inside. I was in a very tall building, and I was reaching out through a window, knowing my father was going to be falling at any time, and the effort was to catch him, but I could never catch him. He'd always slip through my arms. So this is a variation of that dream. I actually haven't had that dream for quite a while until I wrote this poem, but this one starts with my brother falling, and my brother is alive and well. Falling. In this stream, my brother is always falling toward a thin thread bridge, cables of lace-wing nets over black water. I know it is only a dream, even when he accelerates and fades as I arc with him past the black-white orb of a gull's head. The span above is held firm with steel, but he is a plumb line driving past all diving birds that bring the universe down. The Greenland slabs of ice, the quake-ridden Asian shores, beach black with fallen trees. He plunges and spins as if to unload all the sounds of ice and sand to help us fear less, so we can condense and drift to those low Pennsylvania hills we walked that autumn before our father died. Those hills recast now into a green spring backdrop behind the mound where he pitched to my perfect batter's arc beyond the cabin in that field where my father stands in my dreams before he falls like my brother is falling into this great and ruined sea. That poem was written not long after the Indonesian tsunami and quake. And also, I think there had been a report of some of the Greenland ice was just, these massive slabs were falling off. And it's interesting, as a journalist, I designed the front page quite a bit in our paper, and I don't know whether I'm getting older and I'm just more affected by this, but it seems like there's just been one thing after another, the Japanese earthquake, the Indonesian, and so many of those disasters have occurred on my watch where I have to design that page, and it's increasingly difficult for me to do that. But this next poem was actually written after 9/11, another horrific disaster. But I thought I would read it because it doesn't mention that, and it actually seems very resonant with some of my feelings about what we need to do to somehow keep going in the face of some of these things. When night falls. Stonehenge burst into blackbirds, and we saw it go. Now we hoard all we have, move into secret camps, bury our provisions in graves. I look at you and we consume each other in a loss of words. This is the cosmology of fear. We look at each other and there are no stories to tell. This was the last word, we say. Animal sounds lie about us. We clatter our sticks against stone, and when we wake, there is nothing to heal. On the rim of the canyon, I have come to find you. The wind is cold. My hands are chalk. Under the edge, the sun falls suddenly into night, and you are nowhere to be found, even as I call to you. I am here, I say. I will rebuild our fire. Come, and I will tell you a story we both know, the one about the river that angled steeply through rocks. I see it now. It is the voice of color, the light of the plateau, bending to the arc of the river, waking without sound. One of the ironies of that poem is the story without sound. I love sound. Every poet loves sound because we love language. And sometimes, as you've noticed, I don't have a lot of humor in many of my poems, but every so often I do try something a little different because I try to break the pattern of my thinking. And a few years ago, I started just putting words together that don't normally go together, and actually made up a few words just to see what would happen. And this is one of those poems my favorite, actually, of the ones that I did in that vein. It's called Making Love to Sound. Will you love me in this graven night? Will you be my kissy-coo, rising from said-inclined darkness? Let no declension, no sodden-mouthed sorrow stop us. Those are mere words, the panzoic hidey-holes of unfathomed canyonaria, and they must not hold us. Oh, be my kissy-coo, be my bogmate out of fog-benighted clay with no more fears of fandango. Be the full immusion. Whip your windy flaminaria out of fallow land. Break your cummerbunds and take me in wide cantamarous meadows with songs of salpinating flukels. Let us find our tendrils without allowances, unbound by dearth or death, moving ever out of saw-whip webs on sailless seas. Let us freshenate our minds, play clavicordia of dared ascent, bellow the holy yippee-ha we were made for, this tankard-light cornucopia, this always, oh me, oh my, oh. I don't know where that came from, but it's interesting when you try to do it though in a seasonal vein. I had trouble because it didn't quite work as well. So I like the idea that it forces me into something humorous, or some people have said they like it as a love poem, which it is in a sense. I do sometimes, as you've noticed, I do use Spanish occasionally in my poems, and I don't know the language the way I did when I grew up down there. I was bilingual at one time, although I think of course my vocabulary ended at age 13, but it does sometimes take me back there, and I'm going to read the title poem of the book, and it's a strange poem, but much of my writing does come out of my dreams. And Ralph Salisbury, one of my favorite poets in Eugene, talks a lot about how dreams really animate his poems. And I really pay attention to dreams. When I can remember them, I write them down. And not all of them end up as poems, but some do. And this one came out of a feeling I was having that my wife was actually sort of entering my dreams or speaking to me as I was dreaming, possibly to change the direction of the dream, but the poem is something different than that. And I made up an epigraph for it, which goes, "In time he could only speak to her in dreams. The sky is a bird of sorrow. He saw the dry rivers as he slept with her, palm to her back, touching the echo of furrows in her breathing. He saw bats dying in webs of light, snakes bleeding in mountains lost to him, and wanted to walk above the sound of their sorrow into vines and orange butterflies. Las mariposas, he said, trying to raise her in his dream. I was in a place of butterflies, and their wings were like black pearls. He did not believe she heard him, but believed she whispered to him as he slept, I want tranquility, and you are the bird of shadow. He looked for tranquility in his dream, green and red shutters on a bay whose windows opened to air strung with the breath of fruit. He saw fishermen's boats tilting on the sand, a rush of insects, a rolling sea, and the bird of shadows lifting from the trees. He rose from her sleeping body then to yellow lights and the smell of salt, crooning the morning song he'd written to her as he'd slept with crossed arms. El cielo es un pájaro de lágrimas, y soy el pájaro de sombra. The sky is a bird of sorrow, and I am the bird of shadow. I'm just going to read a few more. I won't. Actually, I'm going to read 3 in a row so that I don't have to interrupt it. They're kind of related, but this first one is part of a series I wrote. I ended up a few years ago having blood clots appear in my lungs, and it came completely out of nowhere, so that I had to go to the emergency room, actually. And it turned out I was in the hospital for 4 days, and then I was on disability for 3 weeks, and during that time these poems came to me. It was a sort of coping with this thing that had happened to me. I later found out that I have a genetic flaw which makes me more prone to having clots, and so I'm going to have to be on blood thinners indefinitely, but at least I was able to find out. Anyway, I didn't go into another world, which is alluded to in this poem. This poem is not that, who knows what that world is like, but this is called Sea Change, and all of these poems in this series, this is the only one from that series I'm going to read, are come out of epigraphs from Rilke's elegies and sonnets to Orpheus, which I had been reading that winter. The blood clots came, I believe it was about this time of the year, actually, now that I think of it. And this is the epigraph. Every angel's terrifying, almost deadly birds of my soul, I know what you are, but oh, I will sing to you. These are the birds along the sea's horizon, where glimmers of waves meet blue-gray lines, of clouds as indistinct as my life, the sun long gone in its orange afterglow and final purples, froth graying into twilight, infinite and beckoning. I lie in a hospital room wired to machines, blood drawn, reduced to images, X-rays, the body's ghosts remembering. Every angel is terrifying, I believe, and this, the most terrible, remains when the mind carries all, singing faintly above every possible leaving, yours and mine. Days later, curtained and alone, I dream of a woman underwater and make love to her, focusing on the turquoise face, that softness of closed eyes and floating hair. There I'll live weightless, breathing water, until one day a wind will come to render me breathless. Then I'll return, recognize this beach that once felt limitless, my feet grains of sand rolling beyond sight. Here was the womb we fell from, when glass turned to release our bodies for an hour, while our minds built fruits of memory as though they would live forever. Malicious meats below a rose window's monumental light. What is it that holds us here? In the spring we walk stunned from ripe green stalks, leaves and shoots reflected in glassy lagoons, while limbs touch the air behind us. Yet somewhere clots gather, attacks of our own blood as we stand atop today's stairs, yawing above a silence, holding fast to the rail. What undertow calls us from this sea's forgotten sand? The mind feels it, asking impossible questions that glimmer just so, only from where we stand. Yet we feel something in that view, or we would not look so long at those clouds pressing to the sea, the light's final collection. Emptiness. We loved each other to fill the emptiness, conjugated the patterns of clouds, danced to the voices of children. At night we looked through windows at stars and imagined them hot with being, and this gave us some comfort when we held our babies close and sang to them. We tried to grasp this emptiness in both hands and mold it to our hearts. We saw it ripen with possibility, the full pulp of the peach, even as its outline was all we remembered. Year by year, we watched the fibers lengthen around echoes of a seedless core. And so the days rolled over us toward the blackest colors we'd known, the plants bursting with buds turning to creases in a cobbled road. We lived in our uncertainty then, an earth relieved of mounds, the crystal black and white of winter, the small sound of the bell. And my final poem will be the one that you hold in your hands. A Silent World. Behind this one it breathes through flesh less tangible than air, rising from dying grass into shadow rivers and the silent tongues of clouds. At times it is an immensity of sand under lines of cormorants, at others the blurred ground of a forest where steps dissolve into roots and snow lifts against stone. Desire will not bring it, only this letting go. Silhouetted trees reaching for spectral crows with hints of an appearance. A rustle through quiet fields in January hills where wild roses carry the scent of pears across waters unseen and unheard, the mute undertow of another earth. Thank you so much.
You know, I want to ask what you're writing, your poetry writing discipline is. And part of it is, since you're a journalist, you know as well, how does that fit together? How do you practice as a journalist and also as a poet?
Well, it's interesting because now, when I started journalism, I was doing some very basic stuff. I was covering night meetings. I was writing police reports and things like that, and some of those actually are interesting. I mean, they're very interesting, but it was pretty cut and dried. And but as time went on, one of the advantages I had is I spent 10 years in Eastern Oregon. That was my first newspaper job. I was in La Grande. There wasn't a lot of hard news there, what we call hard news, which is fires and police reports and things like that. So I spent a lot of time writing feature stories, and I actually used the opportunity to hone the craft of descriptive writing. So a lot of my writing, even over there at that early stage, I wouldn't call it somewhat novelistic, but that's a stretch because you can only do so much. And the writing that I do now, I ended up actually getting out of the writing side of it for a while and was just designing pages, and I also took pictures. I actually had 7 of those years in La Grande. I was working as a photographer mainly, although I did write as well, because in a small newspaper you had to do both. But here, or in Southern Oregon, when I moved there, I was hired as an editor, so I didn't really do any writing for a while, and now I've come back to it with the travel writing, and that I can use description in that too, although you have to be somewhat factual. You have to tell people the beauties of a place and where to go for food and the accommodations and things. But within that paradigm, there's quite a bit of freedom, actually, and you can add a personal touch. It almost becomes as much a personal essay as a travel piece.
Speaking of place, you read about Chaco Canyon, which is an incredibly evocative place, as is your poem. And now you're near the Rogue, you've lived in Eastern Oregon. Is there a place to which you feel most connected? Like, have you found a home for your soul or something?
Well, I do like to feel that, and I didn't want to also be too dismissive of cities, because The cities have an energy too, but I do not feel, I mean, I'm trying to think, except for cities that, and Portland has Forest Park, it's very linked with nature, but there are times when I have to go to places that other people would consider bleak, and they would be very unnerved by it. The odd thing about the desert, and I don't know that I would want to live there because it's dry, and I would go at times of the year like the autumn when it was cooler and it was a little bit more hospitable. But it's a paradox. You go there and you feel this incredible diminishment, but you also feel an enlargement there. And both of those things are there together. And it's something, I probably feel that a little more there than anywhere else, but I have felt it in Eastern Oregon. I sometimes feel it in parts of Southern Oregon. And I sometimes I felt it up here, but it just seems to be more prevalent for me in places like that. And I don't know that I don't really have a heritage of coming from a place like that. I mean, I do believe somewhat in an ancestral heritage, but my ancestors were all pretty much from the East Coast. They were Pennsylvanians. But I don't consider myself, I mean, I was actually born in New York City, lived there all of 3 months, and I consider myself a Westerner. I mean, when I go back there, I just feel very out of place. It's not a place that I think I could ever live. But the town that my father was born in was a small town, about 5,000 people. There's a lot of farmland there, and there are mountains around it, which is very much like what the Rogue Valley is like. So in some ways, I feel like there is some resonance there. Sorry, my answers were so lengthy.